My name is Tessa West, and I'm a social psychology professor at New York University. And today we're going to be talking about managing difficult conversations in the workplace. So I want to start off today by showing you this image of a woman. She actually comes from one of the experiments that I ran at KPMG in Sydney, Australia. And what we did in this study was we had people come into our little lab and they negotiated with someone from their own workplace who either had more status than them, so a boss or a manager, or less status than them, so someone who reported to them. And what we had people do is engage in this negotiation. And afterwards, we told them who won the negotiation and we instructed them to give feedback to the person who actually lost. So here you see this woman. She's engaging in what we call a brittle smile. She has a very tense kind of look on her face. You can see the veins in her neck are sticking out. She has these tapes around her neck where we put those on to measure her heart rate, her physiological indicators of stress. And this is a really fascinating example of someone who actually out-negotiated her boss. So she did better than her boss did. And then she had to give this person upward feedback on what he could have done better to actually win the negotiation. What we found was actually pretty surprising. She didn't give him any negative feedback. If anything, all she did was compliment him the entire time. And throughout the interaction, she was smiling. She was engaging in positive nonverbal behavior. She was making eye contact. She was laughing. And so what this study really taught us is that when people feel the most uncomfortable in social interactions, when they're kind of cringing the most, they're really engaging in what we call anticipatory anxiety, they're really stressed out about the encounter, is when they give off the most mixed signals. Discomfort leads us to do the thing that's the opposite of what's actually the most practical and the most useful in social interactions. And because of that, because of this miscommunication or these mixed signals, it's very difficult for us to learn how to accurately read people at work and to rely on people's nonverbal signals to figure out what they're thinking and feeling. So what I've learned in my work and what I think an important lesson going forward and what I'm going to be thinking about the whole time throughout this talk is that there's really no magical skill set that you can have. You can't really learn to read people better. We can't learn what a eyebrow move or what a fidget means. We can't learn when someone's uncomfortable versus, when they're relaxed. It's very difficult. People give off a lot of these mixed signals. And instead, what you have to do is learn how to have clear and open communication at work, even in the most uncomfortable situations that you encounter. And the best way of doing that, especially for leaders, is to build structures and systems into the workplace that provide for safe collaboration and they can keep toxic behaviors in check. So instead of trying to read the room, figure out who's not getting along with whom, learn how to be a charismatic or an empathic leader, these things are all good, but they're actually not super useful for dealing with difficult situations at work, for dealing with conflict at work. So what I'm going to be doing today in the remainder of my talk is to just go through a couple key principles that you can embrace if you want to have better communication at work and better strategies for dealing with uncomfortable conversations. So the first piece of advice I have is you really need to focus on building what are called equity-based procedures. So often it's the case when we face difficulties at work. Say, imagine you're managing a team and there's a bunch of free riders, people who aren't really pulling their weight. Or you have an up-and-comer who's really eager and excited to impress the boss. So maybe they take on, some roles that aren't really appropriate for them. They're trying to impress, but it's a bit of an overreach. These types of uncomfortable social interactions at work, we often try to handle with a bit of a whack-a-mole approach, a one-off approach of, bringing that person to our office or managing that conflict. But instead, what I like to do are create procedures and processes that can help prevent these difficult situations from occurring in the first place. So here's an example of one that I've actually developed for dealing with free riding on teams. What happens when you have people taking advantage of one another on teams? How can you get this information out of people without asking them to tell on each other? You can create 2 checklists. One, have everyone in the team sit down before the work is actually started, and they need to actually, distribute that work, figure out who is going to do what, get everyone on the same page with what work each member of that team agrees to do ahead of time. Then you're going to set up some pulse surveys. You can do this at the end of the week, the end of the quarter, the end of the project, whatever timeline makes sense to you. After the work is done, you're going to ask them 2 questions. What work did you get done from that first list? And what extra work did you do that wasn't on that list? And the second question is really critical to actually weeding out free writing. So if you have one person who's distributing their work equally among, say, 5 group members, and all 5 of those members are writing pieces of information down, you're just much more likely to get that information out of them, doing a procedure-based approach than going, office to office and asking them. So this is a kind of deceptively simple procedure-based approach to dealing with conflict at work that's really just critical to manage it and to, teach and train other people on how to actually execute it on a regular basis. The next piece of advice I have is granting voice to folks. So often it's the case when we feel like we're not getting ideas for our contributions at work, we try to step in the moment, we try to get that, contribution or that, kind of emphasis back on what we've actually done to help a team. But instead, you can give some processes and procedures that teach people how to echo each other's contributions in the moment. Come up with policies where everyone in the room, if they notice someone's not getting credit for their work, they'll call out the original contributor and say, Mary, that was a great idea that you came up with earlier. Let's expand upon that. You can also really focus on giving credit for individual contributions at the end of a project, even if the group as a whole pulled off the job. And this is actually a strategy that I learned from the folks at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory when they were building the new Mars rover. They felt like they weren't getting individual contributions for their work, even though, they were working very quickly and very efficiently as a team. They wanted to feel like their individual contributions were heard. So they developed this very simple strategy. This week, the team accomplished X, Mary identified problem Y, and Yara solved it with solution X or Y. So just giving that individual contribution as they go, giving that kind of heads up, that pat on the back makes people feel like their ideas are heard. And it's a great way to lift up people who come from disadvantaged groups or newcomers on teams. The next piece of advice I want to give is really kind of a system of pieces of advice is about how to give feedback. So feedback is something that a lot of people at work find extremely uncomfortable. It really stresses them out. People don't like giving upward feedback. Managers don't like giving downward feedback. They often feel like people get very defensive. And so there is a real kind of science behind how to effectively give people feedback at work. And I really like to build in a multiple step process in my own lab or my own teams when we develop, these strategies for giving and getting feedback. So the first piece of advice I have is, often we have this intuition that we should give feedback in a very holistic way. We should wait till the end of the quarter or some official performance management meeting, really give people this holistic view of, maybe 360, how multiple people perceived them. I'm not a big fan of this approach. In fact, I think you should give feedback immediately. You shouldn't sit on it. Feedback should be small. It should be bite-sized. It should just be baked into the way that you communicate with people on an everyday basis. After meetings, weekly projects, the moment something comes up. And the smaller the piece of feedback, the better. So instead of giving someone a holistic piece of feedback like, you're great at making contributions in teams, but you talk over people and people feel like you cut them off all the time. That's a pretty broad piece of feedback. You'd want to go much smaller and much more immediate. You're great at making contributions, but this last meeting you interrupted about 4 times. Let's think about how we can improve upon that behavior, and make sure this isn't just done during formal evaluations. This is done immediately after anyone does something that requires feedback. I think keeping it really small and specific is key here. When you give this feedback, focus on the behavior in question, not on why you think the person did the thing. So it is just a very natural human tendency to make attributions for behavior the moment someone does something. If someone cuts you off on the freeway or the highway, like that, within a millisecond, you've already made an impression of them, of being a bad driver, of being a jerk. This is an automatic process, but this is something that you're going to have to learn to override in the context of giving feedback. You want to say things like, during that meeting, you interrupted the client 3 times. Don't make an inference for why they did it. You don't want to say, you talk over people, you interrupted all the time. I know you think you're an expert, but it's pretty irritating. The minute you label someone's behavior with an attribution, you make an inference for why they did it, they often get defensive and focus on the why, not so much on the what. So keep it specific without that inference baked in. The next step is above and beyond just focusing on what people need to improve. We often end with, don't do that thing anymore. Stop interrupting, or trust me more, whatever it is that we're trying, whatever goal we have that we're trying to execute on. Try to kind of think about this through a solution-focused lens. So we know when it comes to changing behaviors, when it comes to changing habits, when it comes to changing how we behave at work, the best thing that we can do is if we have a negative behavior we don't want someone doing anymore, we need to replace it with something else, not simply tell them to stop doing it. So I tend to really kind of turn lemons into lemonade in the workplace, especially around some of these more difficult behaviors. A classic example of this is someone who bulldozes or talks over people. If you have someone like this on your team who's constantly interrupting or soaking up the oxygen in the room, what you can do is think to yourself, okay, how can I then utilize that to create a better, more inclusive workplace where someone who's comfortable speaking up can echo the contributions of other team members? So I mentioned earlier the idea of granting voice. One of the most effective ways you can do that is if someone who's comfortable speaking up will then echo the contribution of someone who's less comfortable. You have someone who talks over people on teams. A solution-focused approach to dealing with that behavior is, since you're so comfortable speaking up, it'd be really great if you could bring, say, Talia into the fold next time. I think she's worried about speaking up. So this person now has a goal in mind. There's an action that they can do. Instead of using that time, using that confidence to just make their own points, they can do it to actually echo the contributions of another person. And I think there's a lot of skills in the workplace, like people who have a tendency to micromanage, to kind of over control folks. You can really utilize that skill to help them with organization, keeping track of spreadsheets. These kinds of things I think can really be reutilized when you re-engage people who have a trait that we typically think of as being, kind of very difficult in the workplace. And I think, there's a lot of tips that we can do, a lot of small daily actions that we can do to actually improve the workplace. Many of them are really bite-sized. They're little. They're things like decrease people's uncertainty at work by making very clear email communications. I think just thinking about how we can hit upon the psychology of what makes us uncomfortable at work, which is often anxiety, uncertainty, impression management, saying the wrong thing, giving negative feedback to someone who won't take it well. These are all barriers we all face, but we can build structures and systems that are small and daily, and they don't require us to be empathic or charismatic or, quite frankly, even really well liked at work to really execute upon. So I hope I've given you some easy, actionable tips that you can practice today, that you can teach to other people, and that you can scale within your own workplace. So if you want to learn more about my book, Jerks at Work, or any of the interviews, or even the surveys that I've done, including some quizzes you can take on whether you're a jerk at work, you can check me out at tessawestauthor.com. And if you want to read more about my research, you can look that up at tessawestlab.com. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for listening.